The Lowcountry may experience some impacts from Milton later this week. Today, I talk one-on-one with Charleston Weber's Jared Smith for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Jared Smith with Charleston Weber. Welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups, sponsored by the Corby Law Firm.
Thanks, Quintin. Good to see you.
Oh, I appreciate it greatly. Needless to say, we were just talking about this off camera, but obviously we were going to come and talk about something totally different, which was Helene. But now we're talking about, obviously, Hurricane Milton, which will be coming to the United States coast, particularly Florida, coming soon. And right now, I believe it has intensified into a 175 mile per hour Category 5 hurricane with strengthening ongoing. And I know its peak intensity, as you know, will decrease on its approach to Florida. So as we sit here right now, what's new, what's now with Hurricane Milton?
Yeah, so we're going to get an update from the Hurricane Center. Right now, we're recording this around 4:30 for our viewers here, but I'm expecting an update from the Hurricane Center at any time on Milton. Hurricane hunters have been going through that plane pretty much throughout the day. They had to leave for a while. They made 5 passes into the center, and every time they made a pass, the pressure dropped several millibars. So the minimum pressure as of that last pass was 911 millibars. And the next strongest storm by pressure is Dorian. Remember Dorian,
right?
And we are in that territory. This is tying Michael for the second hurricane, Cat 5 hurricane in the Gulf, in the satellite era, which starts 1966. So it's not to say that hasn't happened before, but in our recorded history and what we have, it's pretty unprecedented. So Milton, is continuing to intensify. Looking at the satellite imagery, everything is continuing to look, unfortunately, very healthy as far as the hurricane goes. Pinhole eye, no sign of it, weakening to do an eye wall replacement or anything like that. So definitely something very concerning in the Gulf. And as you mentioned, it will lose a little steam heading to Florida, but that's not going to be much of a consolation. A hurricane hit, a major hurricane hit, Cat 3, coming in from the west on the west coast of Florida, is often considered a worst case scenario for that state, especially Tampa Bay. This is the subject of many tabletop exercises, and it does not look good in that area. And Tampa is still recovering from actually a fairly, it doesn't get a lot of attention, but they took a pretty hard hit from Helene. There are a lot of the barrier islands there. There's still a lot of debris on the ground, and that is very worrying. With Milton looking to roll into town later this week.
And I've always wanted to visit Tampa Bay. Would love to visit in the future and pray to God that they won't get a direct hit there. But let me ask you this. If a system like this is moving from, say, west to east instead of south to north, of course, is the south side of the storm, Jared, now considered the stronger side?
It's definitely not ideal. It definitely messes with that a little bit. Now, typically speaking, you're still going to have, because of the circulation of the hurricane, you're still looking at that eastern side as the place where your tornadoes are going to happen. That's where you're going to get, that's where the feed of moisture is ultimately coming into the storm. And modeling is suggesting that some dry air is going to encroach in on the south side, which might cut off a little bit of the rain there. That being said, that is the onshore flow for for the west coast of Florida. Tampa does not want a track that brings Milton north of the Tampa Bay metro. That is the worst case scenario for Tampa. If anything, something a little bit further south, yes, they might get on that, that more northern side of the storm, and they're going to run into the risk for tornadoes anyway for at least a period of time ahead of the landfall. But at least the worst of the surge impacts would not affect them. So that's the issue that we're looking at right now. That's the big question amongst folks in Central Florida is, where in relation to Tampa is it going to come in? And that's where, we tell people don't worry about the track. And in many cases, that's true. The effects of Milton are going to extend well away from the circulation. But in this particular instance, that track is actually going to have quite a bit of bearing on what that water load might look like for the Tampa Metro. So certainly something that we're keeping a very close eye on there.
And I know I've been hearing some comments about obviously Tampa Bay being spared for a couple of hurricanes in the past.
Mhm.
Uh, do you see that as the case this time around? I know you just mentioned it just a little bit.
It's concerning. I think people should prepare as if their luck is going to run out. Um, I think that's the approach that people should be taking. They should be getting ready for a direct Category 4 strike. I realize the forecast says Category 3 as of earlier today, but the general thinking is that you always prepare a category up. This is what we recommend to everybody, and people in Tampa should be preparing for a Category 4 strike. If they're ordered to evacuate, they should leave. Um, it's critical to get people out of the way of this thing. We need to get people out of the way of the water here. They dealt with some incredible surge during Helene, and this is it's hard to believe, but this is very likely, again, depending on that ultimate track, could eclipse that.
Do you, in your mind, from all of your experience and all of your years in forecasting and weather, do you consider Milton to be smaller in size than, say, Helene?
Well, it's starting that way right now, and typically these smaller systems are the ones that can really ramp up very quickly to that Cat 5 intensity. The wind fields right now don't spread out very far. However, as Milton gets closer, it's going to start interacting with the frontal boundary that's going to be draped kind of across Georgia, across Florida, across Georgia. It's going to actually bring us some fairly nice weather over the next couple days. It's going to cool things off a little bit,
Yes.
and that's going to be all well and good. But the problem is that um, that high pressure building in from the north is going to pinch the gradient, and the wind field is going to expand.
Wow.
So Milton's central core may not be as strong when it makes landfall as it was now as of this recording, about 4:30 on Monday, October 7th. It's going to the wind field is going to expand with time. So that central core is going to wind down, but the breadth of the storm is going to expand, and so that's going to expand those surge impacts. It's going to make that, the overall field where tropical storm force winds is going to expand. That could expand into the Lowcountry. That's something that that we're watching closely. Is that it's not going to be maybe necessarily the tornado event that we had with Helene, but yeah, there's certainly the risk for coastal flooding is very real. It looks like we're going to have a major coastal flooding issue on Thursday, for example, here, and we're going to be well away from the center of this storm. So again, that's where Charleston has not been in the cone and probably will not be in the cone again for this. But that does not mean that we're getting away from any impacts.
Right. Ooh. And besides those tornadic activities, God forbid, what else can we experience here? And besides the coastal flooding, of course.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I'm very happy that we're not going to deal with the tornadoes again. We're going to be on the north side of the storm, and we're going to be on the cool side of the cool front too. So what that's going to do is as Milton starts to interact with this front and it'll start to expand and become extra tropical. So it's going to wind down as a tropical cyclone. It will expand, but that wind field is still going to push a lot of water in. So we are looking at the potential for tides well over 8 feet on Thursday. We could see significant flooding, road closure flooding for several hours on Thursday, maybe even well into the evening. That cannot be ruled out.
Right.
We could see some rain. Rain is not going to be the big story from Milton. Rain is going to be, maybe an inch or so, kind of getting brushed there, but rain is not going to be the major thing. However, you get some rain on top of flooding, on top of the salt water, you may run into some problems. The wind is going to be an issue too, and we could see some isolated power outages, especially closer to the coast. That high pressure that's trying to build in from the north, and that low pressure of Milton that's going to be moving, cutting across to our south, that gradient between the two is going to pinch. And as you pinch that gradient, it's like when you stand between two buildings on a windy day and it feels that much windier between the two buildings.
Right.
It's the same concept. And so that's something that we're going to have to watch very closely. Again, as I mentioned, there is the potential. It does increasingly look like that we could see some tropical storm force winds, especially in the marine zones.
Yes.
The wave heights could be very, very high. We could have some major surf issues. Beach erosion certainly seems like it's going to be a possibility. The winds are going to be coming out of the northeast for an extended period of time and on the strong side. And that is usually the trajectory that we look at for major coastal flooding. That's the trajectory that we're looking at for things like beach erosion and rough surf and rip currents. So again, this is not going to be Helene.
Right.
You know, every storm is different.
Yes.
This is not going to be what we saw with Helene, and this is not going to be the all-night tornado fest that Debbie was, or Helene was, for that matter,
Right.
which is good. But there still is going to be that risk for some power outages. There's still going to be that risk for strong winds, especially as you get closer to the coast, and that's going to be the thing that we're going to need to watch closely for us.
And unfortunately, our friends on the Albert Palm, Sullivan's Isle, even down Folly Beach and whatnot, they don't need any more beach erosion.
No, they
God
don't.
forbid. Ugh. Where? How soon do you think they'll issue, obviously, warnings for rip currents with this particular storm?
Well, so the risk for rip currents is already high.
Mm.
In fact, the risk for rip currents is already high because of former Hurricane Kirk. That was a Category 4, well out into the eastern Atlantic. All of the waves from Kirk have been making it to shore, and that has increased the rip current risks. And so this is going to be kind of like another punch to the gut as far as that goes.
Mm.
With the way that the high pressure is building in, kind of wedging in a little bit. Again, that northeasterly wind tends to increase that rip current risk as well. So we're already in that high risk of rip currents, and we're going to be there for several days, it looks like.
Wow.
As far as tropical headlines go, I
Yes, sir.
don't know. It is very possible that we could see a tropical storm watch at some point in the next day or so, and a warning thereafter.
Right.
That certainly cannot be ruled out, especially for the coastal waters. I think it's going to be very rough. It's going to be a very rough couple days in the coastal waters. They're almost certainly going to see tropical storm force winds based on the current track. So certainly something that we're going to need to keep an eye on closely. Land-based impacts. Obviously, we've talked about the coast.
Right.
Further inland, probably not as big of a deal as it was with Helene, but still, enough to possibly bring some trees down, especially if soils get saturated from some rainfall.
Wow. And how much rainfall have we received thus far between Helene and this upcoming storm?
Yeah, Helene was not much of a rainmaker here in the Lowcountry. We got maybe 1 to 2 inches in spots, but it really was not that big of a rainmaker. We had some heavy downpours come in, with the rain bands and everything like that. But Helene was very progressive; it moved very quickly, and so as we know, if y'all were up, that Friday morning when we were tracking tornadoes that were moving at 70 miles an hour, we were tracking cells moving at 70 miles an hour. So that's not a lot of time to create a lot of flooding, but we did have some. We did have some flooding. The surge was a little bit higher than forecast. It was on the high end of the forecast, I should say. And so we had some more flooding issues than maybe we thought we were going to with Helene along the coast. But Helene was not the big rainmaker that Debbie was, and Milton's not going to be that either. So I think that's the one thing to keep in mind. So folks in Moncks Corner, for example, Somerville, those areas, it's possible you might not see much, if any, rain from this at all. It looks like that this is going to be more of a rain event for the coast and points further south. Again, subject to change. Keep an eye on it. We'll have to see, what the wobbles bring with the with the Hurricane Hunter data coming into the models and everything like that. What we have noticed is that there's been a southward trend with Milton so far. So we'll see how that plays out as we get into the next, 3 or 4 days. But with that in mind, still, we've got, we've got plenty of other things that we'll have to be concerned about. So something to watch there for sure. But heavy flooding rain is probably not going to be a widespread issue with this event.
Wow. Well, that's good. You probably touched on this just a tad bit earlier, Jared, but will the intensity of this particular storm nudge upward, or will the actual track be upward?
So the intensity of the storm right now, I mean, we're going to, the good news, if there is good news in this, it's going to peak in the next day or so. Hurricanes can only get so strong before that all weather is balanced, right? All weather is trying to find equilibrium, and you hit that point. Maximum potential intensity is a term that has been bandied about a lot today in relation to Milton. And we could get close to that. We'll see how close we get to that. I'm peeking at the satellite right now. It looks pretty good. I mean, it looks very healthy. So we're going to watch that. We're going to watch that very closely. But again, I think it's that expansion of the wind field. That is really
Yes.
the thing that we're concerned about here. A nudge north in the track might increase our exposure to rainfall a little bit further inland, but I'm not too terribly concerned about that. Again, a centerline pass in the low country is highly unlikely at this point with the orientation of high pressure, the orientation of the front, the
Right.
orientation of the steering aloft. It's going to take it more east than north.
Mm. What exactly will be the winds predicted when obviously Milton makes its landfall along the west coast of Florida?
So it looks like right now, and again, we'll be getting an update from the Hurricane Center here shortly. But again, the forecast as of 11 was for 135-mile-an-hour winds. I would not be surprised to see that revised upward. Um, you know, Cat 3, Cat 4. I would not be surprised to see that revised. Into that general range. Florida should be preparing for a major hurricane strike. I think that's the thing there. 10 miles an hour probably isn't going to make that much of a difference. High end high end Cat 3, low end Cat 4 doesn't really make too much of a difference. At the end of the day, this is a potentially devastating situation, a very dangerous situation for the west coast of Florida, and folks should be preparing as if it's going to be a high end Cat 4. We hope that's not what it comes to. We hope it comes in, closer to that forecast. But that forecast is still bad. That forecast is still very bad.
Yeah. Oh man, it really is. We talked about this too off camera, but do you foresee this as 2004 all over again, 2005 maybe?
I'm sure they're starting to feel that way. I mean, the only other storm that intensified faster into a Cat 5 was Wilma in 2005.
Oh,
So, I mean, Wilma went from, tropical storm to Cat 5 in 8 hours. This took 12, which is really not much of a consolation.
right.
If 4 more hours, whoop-de-doo, right? But it just shows the volatility in the Gulf and the environment that we're dealing with right now. And again, that environment is going to become a little bit more hostile to the tropical cyclone as it moves more eastward, but it's not going to be enough to really blunt that impact on Western Florida. So, but yeah, I mean, it's very possible that they're starting to feel like 2004. I mean, they've taken a hit from Debbie, they've taken a hit from Helene. Now they're going to take a hit from Milton. And if you remember, in 2004, they got back to back to back to back strikes. Charlie, Francis in particular, a very potent 1-2 punch.
Yes.
Yeah, this is definitely shades of that for sure.
Wow. I thought about this before we came on, obviously on the air here, but how often does a hurricane actually develop right in the middle of of the Gulf Coast like this?
Well, it doesn't happen very often in October. Well, these days, I mean, again, what we're starting to see is that the Gulf, the sea surface temperature anomalies are so high that we're starting to have to figure out. It's like, okay, what climatology might not be fitting this as well as it used to.
Mm.
Typically, this time of year, we're looking for homegrown systems. We're looking for systems in the Gulf. We're looking for systems in the Caribbean. We're looking for systems in the nearby in the Atlantic. The Eastern Atlantic would typically be winding down, although it's not been doing that either. We still have, Kirk just made a post-tropical transition today, but Leslie is still out there right now. Leslie's not going to be a threat to anybody, but gives you a general idea again. And the Hurricane Center is looking at a spot out there for possible development as well. So again, like this is not, this is not, this is not over by any stretch of the imagination. But climatologically speaking, we do get systems. Now, do they become Cat 5s? That is the anomaly. That is what's different. These things getting so strong so fast. And I hate to say it, but in the last 5 or 10 years, it's almost become the norm more than anything else. I mean, we've been talking, you talk about climatology and everything there. And generally speaking, they should be a little bit weaker. We start to see the jet begin to dive a little bit more south, increase the wind shear, things like that. But with the sea surface temperatures the way they are, and Helene's fast movement didn't really churn up much cool water.
Right.
And the depth of the water is the warm water depth is very, very deep. So, I mean, that's what we've got here. You've got high pressure set up, right atop it. It has plenty of ventilation. It has plenty of room to breathe, and it has plenty of fuel to draw from. So that's why, when we look at, the maximum potential intensity on a storm like this right now, where it is up about 190 to 195 miles an hour. It will probably not hit that ceiling, but it gives you an idea of the environment that we're working in, and that is certainly a little bit different than what we're used to historically in October.
I hate to ask this silly question, but going forth, how, is there any logical way to really stop all of this intensity with these hurricanes?
I mean, it's going to take it's going to take a lot. I think as long as we keep the sea surface temperatures high, as long as I mean, if we go into yet another warm winter, I mean, it looks like a La Nina winter is a possibility.
Yes.
That typically does not help. Um, it typically does not help, and so something that we observed all winter last year was that
Yes.
the sea surface temperatures in the Gulf were basically tropical ready almost all winter.
Huh.
And if that remains the case this year, which is a possibility, then we may be in this cycle for a while. Uh, it would take a significant shift, and you know, and there's a lot of hand wringing and things about climate change and things
Sure.
like that. But this is one of those things that that you can directly measure, that you can see, and it's like, yeah, something's different. Something's very different here, and it looks persistent, and it looks like it's going to be with us for a while. Um, so, not a lot we can do. Despite conspiracy theorists, uh, you know, uh, claims to the contrary. Look, if we could stop these storms from forming, we'd do it. I mean, that's if we could control the weather, we make it to where our forecasts are right all the time. So, I mean, that's there's been a lot of misinformation around that too, and that's been complicating the whole thing with Helene, and that's going to complicate things with Milton as well. So, really, not a lot we can do. We just have to become more resilient to it.
And when you think of obviously Milton, Jared, isn't this like really two tropical depressions in your mind coming together?
Well, I mean, in a sense, it's what's happening in Florida right now is that yes, they have a low moving over right now. A predecessor rain event is happening
Right.
in Florida right now. But no, this generated on its own. This was actually kind of a remnant of something that came in from the Pacific, and that's what was and it moved into a favorable environment and was able to get going. So it wasn't necessarily a merger here. Now the satellite presentation is interesting because you do have a burst of thunderstorms
Mm.
on the on the northeast flank of the storm, which is persistent, and it seems like that's a kind of a common characteristic of these tight, small but intense hurricanes. So that's been interesting. It's going to be a point of research. I'm sure a lot of good research is being done now. We have the planes that can fly in and stay with these storms a long time, and I can't imagine the ride that the hurricane hunters had earlier today. I cannot imagine that that was pleasant.
I just read on Facebook. I want to go back into it. I hope I can get to it. But I heard that some birds are actually stuck
Mhm.
in that whole system because of the winds are so high.
Yes, the hurricane hunters specifically called out in their observations that a flock of birds is caught in the eye, and that happens. That happens often, actually. And when a storm gets closer to landfall, we can actually see that on the radar. We'll see the using some of the dual pole,
Right.
technology that helps us see debris in tornadoes. Also helps us see birds in the eyes of hurricanes.
Mm.
So we'll see a lot of meteorological, uh, you know, targets come back around, highly correlated, lots and lots of raindrops come back,
Mm.
and then we'll get things that are differently shaped in the
Right.
eye, and it'll show up as like a blue patch where the eye is, and those are the birds that literally get caught up in the eye. They're flying around the calm of the eye,
Mm.
and they're moving along with the storm, and because there's no way out.
Right.
Um, that those eye wall winds at the surface, 175 miles an hour.
Wow. And moving forward past Milton, I really do hope because I'm enjoying this weather right now here in the Low Country.
Yeah.
But I'm praying to God it stays warm like this for the next couple of months. I know that's not realistic, but
Yeah, I mean, maybe not like this. I mean, today was going to be, today was going to be the warmest day of the week, and we're going to cool down a little bit as we get into the rest of the week. And Milton is going to help kind of draw in some cooler air on its backside as well, and that's going to drive us, that's going to drive our lows into the low 70s, possibly Thursday into Friday, along with cloud cover and maybe some rain. But we will see a little bit of a warming trend over the weekend. It looks like we should be back in the 80s by early next week. But again, we are getting into that time of year where, climatologically speaking, we should be dipping below 80 for our highs before you know it. So, We'll see how that goes ultimately, and how that works out. But yeah, the trend is towards a little bit more fall like weather as we get into this week and possibly into next as well.
Well, looking forward to all of that. Well, Jared Smith with Charleston Weather, thank you so much for your time. And again, welcome back to Quintin's Close Up, sponsored by the Corby Law Firm.
Thanks again for having me, Quentin. Always a pleasure to talk to you, even if the circumstances aren't always the best.
Yes, sir. You're right about that. Thank you.